Afternoon, my name's Doug Nelson. The name of my farm is Nelagra. I want to show you this afternoon how farming practices combined with adequate irrigation can create a soil condition that will infiltrate more water in the off season than what we use through the pivot itself during the irrigation season. Follow me into the field. Okay, first of all, let's plant this crop. Keep in mind it's an irrigated crop, or at least irrigation potential. We start down here in the soil. We plant the seed about 2.5 to 3 inches deep. And with irrigation, assuming we don't get the proper moisture to germinate that crop, we can supplement it with irrigation and get this crop to canopy. In other words, shade the ground. And that shade becomes a herbicide, so we don't have to use so many chemicals. You notice down these rows here you don't see any weeds, but I'll show you in the next farm that we're going to stop and look at where we have a lack of canopy. We got a weed problem. So if you can use irrigation to guarantee that you're going to get a crop canopy, you probably don't have to use so many chemicals to control your weeds. That's a good thing. As we continue to grow this crop here, as the corn plant increases in stature, the roots increase in depth. Generally, the root depth is about equal to the height of the plant. It's an awesome crop. About 50% of the organic matter that you see here above the ground, of all the organic matter, about 50% of it is located above the ground. The other 50% is located in the root zone. It's part of the roots. And let's take a look at this ear right here. We're harvesting the sunshine. There's no coincidence. This yellow corn here is the same color as the sun. This is solid sunshine right here. We're harvesting the sun through photosynthesis and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the minerals and the water in the soil. We're creating solid sunshine that we can use for energy, cattle feed, hog feed, any kind of feed. We can create corn syrup from this, corn oil from this, and a whole multitude of products come from corn. If we harvested this crop for silage, with a crop of this stature, I would guess at 65% moisture, we could get about 25 to 28 tons of silage per acre. You back the moisture out of that, and you got a lot of carbon that we've harvested off of the atmosphere, off of the CO2 molecule. That's where the carbon comes from to create this plant. We take the carbon off the CO2 and we turn it into a corn plant, and this corn plant releases the O2 part of the CO2 molecule, which is oxygen, gives us fresh air to breathe. The water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the money cycle, as related to the economy, have a common denominator. If money isn't moving in the economy in a productive way, it doesn't do much good. If water isn't used in a productive way, it doesn't do much good. And if carbon isn't in the cycle, like nature designed it, we couldn't grow a crop like this. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen in round percentages. It's 21% oxygen and 1% argon. So if you're quick with mental arithmetic, you'll see that that comes up to an even 100%. But I mentioned that's round percentages. Many people don't know this, but in the rounding of those percentages, less than 0.5% of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, and that's all this crop has to work with to come up with the carbon to create this leaf, this stalk, all the roots, and this wonderful nice ear of corn. All we take off of this field, at least in my situation, is these little kernels here. That's the only thing we harvest. Everything else goes back into the soil, goes back into the cycle, and the biology in the soil and the environment that we can create with the proper moisture, proper canopy to create the proper temperature down here for that biology to exist, will recycle almost every single bit of the nutrients that this crop has taken out of the soil It'll go right back down. The earthworms, the soil bacteria, the molds, the fungi will break that all back down into a mineralized product that the next crop can use. So that's about all I have to say about this field. We're going to move on to the next one. Part 2, the benefits of irrigation. I want to point out one thing about irrigation, and we can create a crop canopy that we can depend on, and sunshine is energy. And as you can see here in my pivot driveway, I've got a pretty nice crop of weeds, and they have been able to intercept sunlight because there is no canopy here. And so we got a little crop of weeds growing. But out here in the cornfield, this has all been sprayed the same with the same herbicide, but I can generally get by with about 25% less pre-emerge herbicide if I can count on a canopy happening. With irrigation, we can plant a little thicker, and we can keep this crop developing on schedule so the leaves canopy the row and intercept the sunlight, so we don't need quite so much herbicide. We can use the canopy as a herbicide, and the evidence is right here. As soon as we get a little gap in our corn or a break in the stand, we got some weeds. But I take advantage of the crop canopy and save some money on my chemical bill. Now, we need to go in this field here, down here, and then we'll go down a row a little ways. And I want to show you how, with timely irrigation, you can create a soil biological system that will do your tillage for you. And it will incorporate last year's crop residue, and it will allow the surface roots to feed on the fertilizer that we apply, because in a no-till situation, you cannot incorporate the fertilizer. You have to allow for nature to do it, or provide the ingredients for nature to make that happen. And so about tasseling time, I want this crop well watered, because it's finished growing roots. As it increases in stature, it will develop roots, and at that time of the year, I like to make it work for a living. In other words, I like it to put those roots down deep. But about pollination time, it's starting to change its thinking about things, and instead of growth and vegetative growth, it's thinking about reproduction. And that's when you need both water and fertilizer and very, very little stress. And the tassel right here, it's wrapped up with this flag leaf. This flag leaf protects the tassel until the conditions and the timing are right. And when the sun gets about 10 o'clock high one morning after a nice cool night, this flag leaf will unravel and expose the tassel to the sunshine. And these little deals like here look like a grain of wheat are called anthers. They're covered with pollen, and the pollen granules are about 98% moisture. And as soon as that gets dry and you get a little breeze like we have today, it'll shake that pollen down, and it'll land on the silks of these ears here and fertilize the kernels. The silks are all brown now, but at that time of the year they're soft and silky and a light green color. And that little pollen granule will travel down the silk until it gets to an ovule here on the cob, and it creates a kernel. And so at that stage of the crop's life, you want it well watered and low stress and a good deep root system. And then you want to encourage nature to start converting all the nutrients that it has left in the soil into something this plant can use. So come on in here a little bit and we'll take a look at the soil. Look here. Well, that leaf wasn't being pulled down in, but take a look at this leaf right here. This has been been dragged right over here, and it's going down this earthworm's burrow. Same way with this one also. It's tangled up in this material, and he's trying to pull that into the soil. And we got these these little mounds all over the place. There's one right here, and if you look at this right here, all this crumbly stuff, that's worm castings. That's been through a worm. And you take a peek at that, and it's about 50% organic material, see? And a very, very good potting soil right there. And let's dig this one up and see what we find underneath here. Maybe we can find us a worm. Okay, there's this burrow right there. And I want you to notice the surface roots of the corn right here. See, here's one and here's one. Here's another earthworm burrow here. Here is some organic material that the worm has drugged down in the soil. He's got it in there about an inch now. Notice how it's tied together, kind of wrapped up, kind of like a bird nest. He's been working on that, eating it, and just moving it into the soil. But if you can get a really good close-up, just look at the hair roots, the surface roots from the corn. And we dug this out of the middle of the row. So these guys are drilling roots clear over here, and these guys are drilling roots clear over here. And notice the tilth of this. It just falls apart, and it's very easy for those roots to grow in there. The key is we got to have a little moisture to encourage those roots to grow this close to the surface. And that's what you can do with irrigation. So you get all these microscopic little root channels going for you, plus these worm burrows, and plus all this stuff that the worms are pulling in. Get a really good close-up of this leaf right here. See, the worm has got a hold of my mature crop in the lower leaf, and he started dragging that down the burrow. So he's getting a head start at getting this crop degraded, so it can turn into organic material on the surface for my next year's crop. And I want to demonstrate the permeability and porosity of this soil. Here's a heavy rain right here. That's about as heavy as you can get. Of course, we get some 3 and 4 inch cloudbursts, and there's nothing that'll hold that. But did you see how quickly that went into the soil? So without irrigation, it's hard to create this because you just don't know what Mother Nature has waiting for. And look at this huge mound of material here that's been pulled together by the earthworms. And you know, you see some of this stuff standing straight up. You know, nature didn't do that. I mean, nature did it. Earthworm's a natural thing, but something is happening, and there's just lots and lots of them. Here's a large one. Here's one. Here's another one here. And here's one, and here's a group of them. Here's one, here's one, here's one. And you can look down the row and see how these leaves have been pulled. Here's one here that's the worm is trying to take him down the hole here. Here's probably another one yet. Here's another one. So what we can do with irrigation is create the environment to make this biology happen. And it leaves behind a soil that's capable of absorbing more moisture in the off season than what we pump with our pivots. In economics, it takes money to make money. With farming, it takes water to save water. And this is the evidence of it. Many of the fields that I have been operated as dryland fields, and after we got them irrigated, pretty soon we had to lay some tile to drain off excess water. And it's real easy to assume then that we're irrigating too much. I just don't think that's the case, because these tile lines are running nowadays 365 days a year. And they're draining more water off of the field in that length of time than what we pump with a pivot during a normal irrigation season. And in a few minutes, I'll show you some of the evidence of that. Now we're gonna go across the road, and I own the farm on the east side of the road, and I custom farm the farm on the west side of the road. It's all on top of the same hill. The hybrids are similar, and the fertility program and the weed control program are identical. So come on over here, we'll take a look at the soil and see what we see as a difference. This is a dryland field, and if you notice, there's no earthworm activity here. There's no environment to sustain earthworm activity, because the soil, it gets pretty dry, and it's also pretty hard, and hard to push the screwdriver into the soil, where over across the road we had all the surface roots and the moisture in the environment during the growing season, and when the temperature was right, digesting the residue and breaking it down so the next crop could use it. That generally doesn't happen unless you got perfect growing conditions with the right moisture and temperature in the summertime. And without irrigation, you can't always depend on nature creating that situation. Across the road, we had a water infiltration demonstration. I'm going to do that on this field, and I want you to notice the obvious difference. Here you go. Here comes a heavy rain. There it goes. Take a peek down on this side of the row. It's still going. So anyway, that pretty much sums it up. With irrigation, we can create the organic matter, we can create the porosity and the permeability of the soil. The organic matter holds the water like a sponge. If you remember that first crop we looked at, with stature higher than my reach, if you laid that all on the ground like we do, when we get done harvesting, just imagine how much moisture that sponge, these corn stalks, how much moisture that can absorb and hold and allow for a slower soak into your soil. We are infiltrating and soaking up more water on our irrigated fields during the annual rainfall season than what the soil can actually hold, and the excess is bled off into the tile lines. And the tile lines are running more water off of our fields slowly at a controlled rate for stream flow stability. We have tile lines running more in a year, many times more in a year, emitting more gallons than what we pump with a pivot. So we'll take a look at that next. Thanks. This is Dog Creek. We're about 10 miles northwest of Wayne. When I was a younger man, this time of the year, that thing ran about like a garden hose, just a little trickle. This tile line right here was bone dry. You wouldn't get a drop out of it. And over the course of my career, we've added a lot of irrigation. And as you can see, we've changed the conditions of our soils. We're soaking in a lot more water, and we've installed a lot of tile lines in this valley. And the cumulative effect is a flow like this. I talked about carbon. In the stalks, in the roots, we're putting more organic matter in the soil, and that contains carbon. When we run our field sprayers, we have carbon filters in there, so we don't have to breathe any possible toxic fumes or anything when we're running the sprayers. The soil acts like a carbon filter when water soaks through it, because there is a lot of organic matter in it. do you think of that? That's water, and it's good. This is what you get with carbon filtered water from our soils in northeast Nebraska. And part of the reason is because of irrigation and the increase in organic matter in the soil. Now, if you measure the flow of this tile line, you will find that in a year's time it will exceed the amount of water that I use in this pivot over here across the road. And I can show you a couple other tile lines that flow many, many times more water than this, and they've been running 365 days a year. There's an irrigation well about a quarter mile north of here. The NRD monitors the static water level every spring. The static water level at its lowest point in the last 41 years was 12 feet below the surface. The well is 180 feet deep. That means if you excavated the 30 foot of clay and the 150 feet of gravel in the aquifer, if you excavated a hole that deep down to the shale, which is the bottom of the well, at its lowest point in the last 41 years, you would have a lake that's 168 feet deep. So in summary, I'd like to mention that with irrigation, we can plant a thicker crop. We can get that crop to canopy on schedule. We can use that canopy as a herbicide, so we can use a little less chemical than what we normally would need on a dryland field, because the canopy acts as a herbicide. We can create the biology in the soil to recycle last year's crop residue, turn that into fertilizer, and use it in our next crop. So we can minimize the fertilizer application on the growing crop. And furthermore, we can create stream flow stability. As you see, these tile lines are running in the fall here. Last spring they couldn't hardly keep up. In fact, they didn't. There was water running over the surface too. And finally, we can increase the carbon content of the soil with the increased organic matter from the crop, the increased stature, the increased population. All that's eventually working back into the soil and becomes a huge carbon filter. And it creates the water you just seen in that crystal glass. And that pretty well sums it up. Thank you very much.